Hey there. So, I can't remember, unfortunately, I feel bad about this, but I was asked to do a little comparison of two versions of the Tarot de Marseille. Um, the Yoav Ben-Dov version, the CBD, and the Jodorowsky or Jodorowsky Chemois version. Um, and so I thought I would just talk a little bit about both decks and show you the differences. They're very minor. Um, but just also if you are unfamiliar with the work of these two authors and readers, um, I thought I would chat a little bit about that too, and just maybe give a sense of why I prefer one's work over the other. And again, as I always say on this channel, everything is my impression, everything is my feeling. You know what I mean? So it's not this is not the way you should feel. I'm just sharing my thoughts. So here's a little bit about each. So Yoav Ben-Dov wrote a book called, actually what he originally wrote was a book called Tarot the Open Reading, which is available in several languages, and he self-published it, and it's a wonderful book. And it's a brief book. It's very easy to understand, and he has a lot of information on his website. Sadly, he passed away around November of last year, which really is a sadness. Because when you go to his website and you watch interviews with him and you read his book and you listen to him talk, you just get a sense of what a kind of open and generous person he seemed to be. And his family, I think his son in particular is keeping that alive and making the work accessible, keeping the website up, and also working with US Games to get his version of the deck produced. So this was the first book I read that was specifically about Marseille. And I read it into into my journey learning to read pip decks, but it's a great book. I don't necessarily use everything I learned from this book, but I still think it's fantastic. And then recently, earlier this year, Llewellyn republished this, and this was in sort of concert with Yoav Ben-Dov, the Marseille Tarot Revealed. It's the same book. It's just got a different name, and it's a full color, sort of glossy, beautifully, expensively designed. I mean, it's not super expensive. It's a $23 book. The price, I can't remember how much I paid for this. Actually, I have this on my iPad too, because it was something that I wanted to reference a lot, especially as I was writing my book. So there's this version. I think you can actually still get both. But I'm a big fan of his work and what he did, and as he was working on Tarot the Open Reading, he was trying to find a version of the Marseille deck that he felt was a good representation of the Nicholas Conver deck, which is pictured here in sort of an old form. And I'm going to reference this just to sort of show you a little bit of what they did to the decks, what each of them did to the decks. So he was working on negotiating copyrights and decided, I really can't find the version that I want, so maybe I'll make my own. So that's where the CBD came from, and he worked with an artist who copied with ink and brush the drawings by hand, and then he worked with a digital artist who scanned them in and made them into digital art, and then he overlaid that digital art with scans of the original deck and refined them and copied them and tried to make it as close to what he imagines the original would have looked like. But he's very upfront about saying, I did a few things to make it look nice to the modern eye. He said, the coloring, we don't have the process to make the colors, the kinds of paper we're not using anymore that they would have originally used. We're not using the same printing techniques. And also, the people who were viewing Marseille decks when they were originally made would have been more used to seeing severe expressions on faces. So he said, I wanted to keep the personality the same, but lighten or brighten the expression a little bit. Now, on the other hand, and sort of on the other side of the coin, we have, I should probably switch these, Alejandro Jodorowsky, who was Yoav Ben-Dov's teacher. And he wrote this sort of tome on reading with Marseille cards, The Way of Tarot, the spiritual teacher in the cards. And this is a bit more of a esoteric approach. There are similarities, of course, because Yoav Ben-Dov studied with Jodorowsky for quite a while, for 3 years, I think. And so there's some overlap. But because these came later, he sort of took what he learned and expanded on it and refined it in his own way, as we all do. Now, Alejandro Jodorowsky was sort of well known as a teacher, and he was approached by Philippe Camoin, whose family owns apparently what would have been Nicolas Conver's printing studio. So the artist of the Marseille deck here. They did what I call Edward Waiting the deck, right? So they wanted to restore the tarot, the Marseille tarot, to its origin. But what they meant by that was that they, and I'm, sort of quoting, actually, let me quote directly, because this is where I get a little turned off by this particular deck. For us, Philippe Camoin says, Jodorowsky said this, for us, the restoration, which one wrote this? I can't remember. Doesn't matter. They worked on this together. Tarot de Marseille, reconstructed by Philippe Camoin, Alejandro Jodorowsky, was redrawn by hand, stroke by stroke, by Philippe Camoin on a computer. This was not just the restoration of an old deck which had existed, but the rebuilding or restoration of a symbolic system which we call tarot. For us, the restoration, reconstruction, or reconstitution of the tarot is therefore the reconstitution of a structure which we believe must have existed before. Our method is a matter of professional secret. The tarot is a kind of metaphysical device, We utilize symbols belonging to different early decks which were not all Marseille tarots. We also added symbols which were not found in early decks, but which it seemed to us must have been there before. This is also a matter of professional secret. And they do this a couple times, and they're describing the work that they did. They added stuff that they felt should have been there all along, even though they weren't. So while they're sort of reconstituting, rehabilitating, redrawing the Conver deck, they're really just sort of doing what Edward Waite did, which is adding things in and claiming to have information that the rest of us don't. So, while we're granted access to their brilliant work, we don't sort of know why they did what they did, because they won't tell us. Now, in his book, in Jodorowsky's book, he does sort of talk about some things that are in his version of the cards, and why they're there, and, it's a very detailed book. I regret, and again, this is my personal preference, but I regret when I read the open reading, this was sitting waiting for me, and I sort of tore through the open reading initially to read what I felt like must be a much better, larger, sort of meaty book. And I don't, I regret that, because I actually think this is a more palatable, it just jived with me in a different way. So needless to say, I am a little bit turned off by the sort of Camoin Jodorowsky, we have the secrets, you don't thing, because that irritates me in general. It's just a pet peeve of mine. And if I remember correctly, in the Jodorowsky book, he talks about Waite and how he screwed up the tarot by adding things that weren't there, and I sort of think, well, you kind of did the same thing. So here's sort of a reprinting of an early edition of this deck. And you can, I just grabbed this off the internet. There are full recreation decks that you can get. They're not super cheap, and for a collector's item, which something like this would be, I didn't really want to spend the money. But you can get a sense here of the style and the coloration. But of course, over time these change. So one of the things Yoav Ben-Dov says on his website is, I had to look at different versions of this deck and decide on the color palette. I had to sort of make decisions based on the many versions that were there. But you can see it's basic woodcut, and it's stencil painted, and it's pretty standard printing techniques for the time. So and it's something you either love or hate, honestly. Now in terms of these two decks, they're very, very similar. So I'm going to zoom in a touch, and I'm going to just talk through a little bit of the two, and do this fairly quickly because they are Marseille decks. But I'll show you all the trumps, and I'll look at the pips a little bit too. So just in terms of packaging, I've had this one a lot longer. You can see it's pretty beaten up. Now, I didn't know when I was looking for Marseille decks initially that, I didn't know any of the things I just told you, basically. And so I just bought what was the easiest to get. And then when I sort of learned more, I wished I had gotten the CBD, and then very quickly realized I couldn't because Mr. Ben-Dov had passed away. So right out of the gate, I mean, you can see how similar these two are. The cardstock on this one is really thin, really. In fact, let me see if you can see this. Now this is the second edition. I don't know what the cardstock was like of the original CBD, and I know that he was very particular about the cardstock, but you can kind of see how much thicker the CBD is. So it's a thicker cardstock. Now I don't actually mind this. It shuffles really nicely, but it bugs a lot of people. This is a little sturdier, and I like it a little better, but at the end of the day, that's just a matter of preference. The backs are pretty standard, modern iteration of Marseille Fair. They're really just meant to be, hashes, so to speak. So the main difference that you're going to see are tiny, and it really has to do with shading and coloration and choices. Just to sort of point out some, I mean, they're really very slight differences, but if you look at, Ben-Dov sort of has blues in the Fool. It's all red and green here. There's oranges and rather yellow, you know what I mean? So, and I'm not going to do this point by point, but you can also see tiny little things that are not here, or that are here that are not here. And one of the things I actually did when I was reading the book was to go and sort of identify whether those things really existed. And you can see in this edition, the coloration is pretty similar. There's no blue on this guy, but there's blue here. But also this little circle, this thing here, doesn't exist, and it doesn't exist on the original line drawing either, as far as we know. So anyway, but you can, I mean, they are really, really similar. This is an interesting thing. This was a very deliberate choice. On the Magician, there's something in the CBD that's just a little less clear, and it's not super clear on the Magician either. How close can I get in focus? There, see? But it does look a little bit like what's on the Yoav Ben-Dov. So, yeah, one of the main things that drove me nuts originally was on the Pépès. There's this egg here, and that was deliberately added. There's no, I can't find a single version of the Marseille where that was added. Now, I say that it drives me nuts, but on the other side of the coin, I don't necessarily look at the individual symbols. So when I'm reading, you know what I mean? Like both, many folks who use exclusively Marseille really, and it's part of the thing of the open reading is you're really looking at not the meanings of the cards at all, but rather the narrative, and the visual rhymes and the language of the images. And, you know, I'll show you an example of that in a bit, just to sort of give you an example. But yeah, I mean, the details are so tiny. You have this little green thing here that's white here. The crown is a little different. You know what I mean? By and large, the coloring on the Jodorowsky is a little more vibrant, a little more varied. And so if you're not really interested in the minor differences, the Jodorowsky may actually be a little bit more attractive from an, you know, just from a color standpoint. But again, it's so slight. So again, here's something that was added that isn't there. I don't think I have the Pope on that. No, he doesn't show up on there. You know, he's got like the flowers here are colored in and they're not here. But they're very similar. So I'll move a little faster. Just so, you know what I mean? Like, they're almost imperceptible unless you're really nerding out about this stuff. Again, it's just really slight color variations. So in many ways, it just comes down to preference at the end of the day. Especially because many of the things that Jodorowsky added and Kamal added are not even that noticeable if you're not paying attention. Like, I never would have noticed the egg in the Papus if he hadn't pointed it out. So here's an interesting thing where, like, this face in the stomach of the devil is actually in a lot of Marseille decks, but is not in the Convert. And I don't seem to have my Noblette around. I wonder where that is. It doesn't matter. That one does have it. What did I do with it? That's usually my go-to. But again, I mean, tiny, tiny differences. And really everything, you know, if you are concerned with the image, everything you need is there. You know, this kid here has 3 dots. This one has 1. You know, and they don't know what was meant to be there and what wasn't. So, you know, again, I think this is like, you know, if you're really like into symbolism and it doesn't, any historical accuracy isn't as important to you, like, this might be a fun deck for you to explore with the book. I certainly recommend the book, the Jodorowsky book. And then if you're a little more interested in what it might have looked like initially, Ben-Dov might be the way to go. But you know, if you're just like, I want one, then this one's slightly less expensive and it has slightly better card stock. So yeah. So now when you get into the pip, I won't go through all of the pips because they're pips, but you know, you can see the coloration. They're the same image, really. They're just colored differently in terms of, there's the aces. One of the things I think they both did in both editions was they tried to keep things that look like errors or mistakes, which are very common to the printing and the painting. So, and then here are the chords, just to go through that really quickly. But again, very, very tiny. Like, the scepter is blue, this one's black, it's got red, it's, you know. I guess the other interesting thing, if you're really super curious, is that what happens when they recreate decks like this is they're made into vector images, which makes everything sort of very evenly weighted, very sharp. And then what was interesting to Yoav Ben-Dov was to not do that. So he wanted everything to look really hand-drawn. So you can see sort of the difference in the borders, in the titles. You know, he really, really wanted things to look less perfect. I guess the other thing is that the first edition of the CBD did not have a copyright here. It does now. It is fairly imperceptible though. You know, I mean, it's tiny for copyright. This one's a little bit bolder. So, whoops, yeah, no. So just again to sort of show you some of the actual number cards. So again, it comes down to coloration and sort of, you know, what you may prefer in terms of that. So this is an interesting adjustment. But again, it's also going to depend on the edition they worked from, you know, etc. So those are the coins. The wands look like that. And I can show you in comparison. So again, here's the 10 of wands from these two modern decks. This is again Ben-Dov, this is Jodorowsky. And then here here's sort of an original or older iteration of it. So again, I mean, it's like, I guess it's a little similar. So anyway, so that's like a comparison of the cards. They you know, they're pretty straight up Marseille at the end of the day. Now, just to give you a sense of the open reading technique that Ben-Dov talks about, it's very different from how I read, really. I mean, you know, it certainly influenced me in some ways, and definitely in the chapter on the visual language. It was part of it, so let me just show you. In fact, I probably should have just used the majors, because that's one of the things that he does, is he really just sort of focuses in the first half of the book anyway on using the trumps, which is not uncommon with French decks in the sort of the French tradition. But let's see, we'll just do this, and I'll start by pulling out some majors. You know, so in essence what he would do, actually it's not all that different from what Robert M. Place talks about in his book, too, is to sort of look at and then kind of figure out who the story is about, like who's the central character. And in this case, you have a lot of people looking backwards, you know, and so he might say, well, we've got an arrow pointing to this dude who probably is this dude, and then this chick looks like this chick, or actually she's dressed more like this. So like he has a past relationship where he was like the king, you know, the cock of the walk, so to speak, when he was with this woman, you know, who sort of, you know, was like equally equal in status to him, you know, and he's sort of looking back at this old relationship, and it's really affecting his relationship with this woman now, who, you know, is a little bit less queenly, a little bit less, you know, statusy, you know, so he really kind of longs for this former relationship when he was, you know, in like a more high status position. You know, so that's sort of how he would describe the reading. And then suppose, you know, there were a pip card in play. You know, it might be that he is longing for a time when he was building something more complicated. You know, so there was a time, you know, because of the structure and like the complex certainty of this, you know what I mean? The ten of coins, where, you know, and so it doesn't really have to do with the fact that coins are money, although it could. It's like the visual structure of it. Like he was doing a job that was very structured and ordered, and he missed that, and now he's caught between something emotional, you know what I mean, with the Cupid, and he's sort of like longing to be back in a more ordered place, you know. So that's kind of, you know, sort of an oversimplification of what he might say. But there's an interesting example in the book. I'll actually, because it'll be easier to find since I stupidly shuffled it. He has a great example in the book about how, you know, this can really affect the meaning. And I talk a little bit about this in my book, inspired by Camellia Elias a little bit too. This idea that meaning doesn't exist, which I interpret as meaning is fluid to represent the question. But in the book, he talks about how he got this spread for someone who was having relationship troubles, for a woman who was having relationship troubles. And he saw this sort of authoritative person in a really powerful position over this sort of naked, huddled woman, you know, and it ended up representing, you know, a sexual abuse situation from the past. So, you know, how the images sort of interplay with one another becomes a really powerful thing in the open reading. So, but in addition to that, he does go through each of the cards and gives you meanings for them. So if you want to learn in that way, you can. He does go through the elements. He does go through the numerology. So this is one of the sources. Well, you know, this is newish, but this was one of the sources for what I ended up using in terms of my numerology. And also I did use this too, because there's good stuff in this book, even though some of it turns me off. But, you know, it's an interesting way of reading, and I'm not, as I say many times, super visual, so it's not my go-to, you know, but it's not impossible to do, you know, to sort of like look at the images and say, you know, again, we have a woman looking toward these four cups, you know, she looks a little like she might be pregnant. She's sort of guarding herself against this idea of these cups, right? So maybe she's sort of like concerned about how she's going to be able to feed her child, you know, constantly. Like she's sort of like, will I be able to, you know, protect my child and feed my child as it grows, because this is growing. And then there's this sort of prison shape behind her, for example, and, you know, will she feel like she's in a prison, or will her worry in prison? You know what I mean? I'm just sort of making that up, but it's definitely an interesting set of theories. So I really, really do recommend the open reading if you have not read it. I think you can still get this version. If not, you can get this version. And then, you know, again, it wasn't for me, but that doesn't mean it won't be for you. So, and then in terms of the decks, honestly, it's really up to you. I sort of I feel more drawn to the CBD, just mostly because of its author and creator, you know. People's attitude and energy can obviously affect us, and so that, you know, that's that. So anyway, there's just a fairly quick look at the two decks and a fairly quick discussion of these two folks who are kind of linked by the fact that Jodorowsky was Ben-Dov's teacher. So I hope this was interesting for anyone who cares about this stuff. And have a good New Year. It's New Year's Eve.